Boston, winter. The wind whipped through alleyways, as if trying to strip the faces off pedestrians. On a fog-covered sidewalk, a man walked silently, his gait slightly limping, hands buried deep in the pockets of an old military coat worn thin by the years. He didn't ask for money, didn't stop anyone, but people still avoided him when they saw him, like avoiding a crack in the road. Not worth noticing until you trip over it. Inside his inner coat pocket, he kept two things: a faded soldier's ID card and an old photograph of himself with a woman whose smile could soothe even Boston's harsh winter. People said he lived like a shadow, but perhaps he was just waiting for something or someone. And then, one December morning, he was arrested. No evidence, no explanation. Just because the coat he wore matched the description of a suspect. He didn't resist, didn't offer a defense, but in that silence, there was something even he hadn't expected. The name he had tried to keep hidden for so many years was about to bring an entire courtroom to a standstill. Have you ever passed someone and thought they were nothing? Stay. Today, you might see an entire life the world forgot. Follow American Stories and turn on notifications to receive the latest stories. Each one a journey of inspiration, where every brave act deserves to be shared. Boston in mid-January was so cold, the pavement felt frozen solid. The pale rays of winter sunlight weren't enough to warm the air. They only made the frozen puddles shimmer like shards of broken glass. Among the hurried crowd, tucked under thick coats, no one paid attention to the old man with a hunched back, quietly dragging his limping steps along the sidewalk across from Wilson's Bakery. Daniel Brooks, 62 years old, was a silent part of this city. People had seen him for years, wandering around the South End neighborhood, a shadow that made no noise and drew no concern. His thick gray hair was unkempt, his beard patchy around a gaunt face. He often wore an old military coat, its color faded, the sleeve torn open revealing the thin sweater underneath. One foot dragged slightly. The sole of his left shoe had a hole, and each step made a sound as soft as a sigh. No one knew where he lived. Some delivery workers occasionally saw him arrange a few cardboard pieces in front of closed shops, curling up in a corner, as if trying to vanish from the world. In the mornings, he often bowed his head over a trash bin outside the coffee shop, picking out discarded cans to exchange for a few coins to buy a weak cup of coffee. Once, someone saw him help an elderly woman cross the street. No words of thanks, no words in return. Then he disappeared again into damp alleyways, as if he were part of the dust drifting away with the cold wind. Daniel once had a home, a small, quiet place in West Boston, where he and his wife Emily had lived for nearly 30 years. But Emily died in a car accident. On the very day Daniel was stuck at the VA medical center, dealing with a paperwork issue, he couldn't make it in time to hold her hand in her final moments. Since then, Daniel seemed to stop living. He sold the house they once called their peaceful place and donated all the money to the charity Emily had volunteered at in her youth. Then he vanished, walking away from his name, his friends, and everything that once tied him to his old life. There are mistakes you can't fix, only carry. That was the only sentence he ever said to a young social worker, and then he was never seen again. In the old coat's pocket, he always carried two things: a photo of him and Emily by the Charles River, her eyes bright like summer sunlight, and a faded military ID card, the words barely legible. Daniel Brooks, logistics engineer, United States Air Force. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a technical soldier. But Daniel never called himself a hero. He once said, "Doing the right thing doesn't need a name carved in stone. Just knowing it yourself is enough." The only person who still remembered his name was Jaden, a 12-year-old boy who lived with his mother on the 3rd floor of an apartment building on Tremont Street. He had met Daniel one rainy afternoon when his pocket watch fell and broke on the sidewalk. Daniel picked it up, gently wiped it dry, and softly said, "Take care of your time, kids." Then he sat down and fixed the watch with a tiny, rusty screwdriver pulled from his coat pocket. Jaden watched, drawn in by the trembling yet meticulous hands and by the deep, quiet look in the old man's eyes. Since then, Jaden often saved part of his lunch sandwich to accidentally leave behind on the steps where Daniel usually sat. No one said a word. Daniel simply nodded slightly, and Jaden pretended not to notice. Then came that fateful night, as silently and bitterly cold as winter fog. An assault took place near the convenience store by the central station. A staff member was attacked, and a vague description from a witness pointed to a familiar figure. A middle-aged man, military coat, gray hair, limping. Nothing remarkable except it matched Daniel perfectly. When the police found him sitting silently behind a bus stop, holding a cup of cold coffee, they didn't need an accusation. His thin hands were locked in cold steel cuffs. Daniel simply closed his eyes when the click sounded, as if it was something he had expected for a long time. "You're under arrest on suspicion of assault," the officer said, expressionless. Daniel didn't resist. He didn't defend himself. At the police station, he was treated like a criminal. A young prosecutor kept his head down, filling out forms without looking up. The court-appointed attorney arrived late, skimmed the file for less than 2 minutes, then flipped open a calendar to schedule the hearing. No one asked about the old, creased photograph or the faded ID card around his neck. No one asked where he had come from. No one asked if there was anyone waiting for him. Only Officer Garcia, who escorted him to the van, paused when he noticed the ID card. "You served?" he asked gently. Daniel nodded faintly. "I was in Iraq too," Garcia said quietly. But Daniel didn't answer. He just looked out through the van's window at the hurried streets passing by, where no one realized that a human being was being erased from their world. That night, Boston was buried in snow and rain. On the jailhouse camera screen, Daniel sat with his head bowed beside the faded photo and worn military ID. The wind slipped through the narrow cell window, making a strange sound like the ticking of a clock, like the slow passing of time through a man's life. Boston's morning was covered in a thin layer of snow, like white powder dusted evenly across rooftops, old wooden benches, and even the hearts that had long since gone cold. In courtroom 3B of the Suffolk District Court, the pale white LED lights shone down onto the worn wooden table, casting a chill so deep it felt as if nothing warm could survive here. The sounds of paper shuffling, dry murmurs, and the tapping of pens against the desk created a steady rhythm, not the rhythm of life, but of bureaucracy. A morning like any other morning, until a name rang out. Case number 3420, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Daniel Brooks. The side door opened, and Daniel walked in. It was still him in the same frayed coat, with worn-out shoes, and eyes distant like a sleepwalker lost in the noise of the city. His hands hung loosely. The cuffs had been removed from their chain, but red marks on his wrists were still fresh. No one looked at him. No one paid attention. He was just another name among thousands that passed through the courthouse each week, an invisible man in a system already blind to pain. On the judge's bench sat Rebecca Whitmore in her 50s, silver hair tied neatly at the nape, a black robe hugging her frame like the silhouette of a leafless tree. She was known to be fair, firm, and exhausted. Years in the profession had worn down every emotion, or so she thought. Public Defender Langston, a very young man, stood up hurriedly. He flipped through a few pages, speaking in a rapid reading voice. "Your Honor, the defendant is homeless, with no history of violence, and no clear evidence apart from a single witness statement. However, we're willing to proceed with the court's recommendation." Rebecca nodded, expression unchanged. She reached for the next section of the file, eyes still fixed on the page. But when she looked up at the defendant for the first time, her gaze stopped at something faintly glinting beneath the collar of his old coat. A military ID tag faded, hanging from a thin chain, pressed close to his chest. Under the pale lighting, the words D. Brooks, USOF, were etched into the metal. She froze. Her hand remained on the file, but her memory drifted to an old letter. Years ago, her son Tyler Whitmore had written from Afghanistan about an unnamed soldier. He had pulled Tyler from an explosion in Kabul, carrying him through rubble as the medical post caught fire. "His name is Daniel," Tyler wrote, "a technical soldier, quiet, but I'll never forget him." Rebecca had never met that man, but the name, the way Tyler had mentioned him, and the look of unspeakable gratitude in his words she had never forgotten. Her heart beat faster than usual. She lowered her eyes, looking more closely at Daniel. The man in front of her was thin, limping, his face quiet like a weathered statue. But those eyes there was something worn, seasoned, and familiar. "Mr. Brooks." Rebecca spoke, her voice slowing for the first time. "Do you wish to say anything?" Daniel lifted his head, slowly. One beat, then two, then gently shook it. "No, Your Honor," he replied, his voice hoarse like wind hissing through dry trees. Langston turned toward him, about to say something, but stopped. Something bigger was surfacing in that room, though he couldn't name it. Rebecca glanced at the file one last time. Then she picked up her gavel, but didn't strike immediately. "The court postpones the ruling. The defendant will remain in temporary custody for an additional 24 hours pending further information. The defense is requested to provide any and all documents related to the defendant's military service. During this detention, all essential needs must be met, and the defendant's legal rights ensured." A soft murmur rose from the audience seats. Langston hesitated, surprised. That request wasn't part of standard procedure. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, confused. Officer Garcia, standing at the back of the courtroom, looked up briefly upon hearing those words. As a veteran himself, he understood better than anyone the weight of a judge requesting military records. He looked at Daniel. The man his instincts had told him from the start didn't feel like a criminal. Daniel was led out of the courtroom. He didn't look back, but inside the pocket of his old coat, his hand was still holding tight to one item, an old pocket watch, its cover missing, its glass scratched. But inside was still a tiny photograph of Emily. She smiled in that picture. The gentle smile he had lost and carried with him, like a private kind of time no one could steal. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. As the courtroom door closed, Rebecca returned to her office. She opened her desk drawer and took out a bundle of yellowing papers, the letter her son had written from the battlefield. It had been a long time since she'd read it, but now something whispered within her that it was time to turn back the old page. That soldier's name was Daniel, and she needed to know, was the man accused this morning, the one who saved her son's life. The night at the Boston Detention Center felt colder than usual, not because of the outside temperature, but because of the heavy silence pressed into the gray concrete walls, where each human breath echoed back like the sound of being forgotten. Daniel sat in the corner of the cell, his back against the wall, arms holding tightly to an old pocket watch as if cradling a broken piece of time. The watch's hinge had come loose. The glass was scratched like memories no longer whole. But inside still remained a small photo of Emily, the woman with smiling eyes and wind-blown hair. She was laughing by a riverside, perhaps the Charles. Back when they were young, Daniel gazed at that smile as if by staring long enough, it might warm the frozen room. The metallic door opened with a creak that sounded like a scream in the throat. A new inmate entered, young, tall, with a beard and dark tattoos running from wrist to shoulder. He threw a scornful look at Daniel, dropped onto the top bunk, and pulled out a worn phone with its buttons rubbed thin. "Old man," he said without turning, "your story's blowing up online? Stealing bread and pretending to be a veteran. Not bad." Daniel didn't answer. He simply closed the watch carefully, as if shutting a small door in his heart. "I had a brother," the inmate continued, voice sharpening. "He died in Kandahar. And you, walking around with that faded dog tag hoping for sympathy." Daniel slowly lifted his head. He wasn't angry. He didn't defend himself. He just looked. The young man stepped forward, blocking Daniel's view. His eyes were burning not with personal hate, but with something deeper, older, a fury built up over years of being treated like dirt by a system he once believed would protect his family. "You insult my brother," he said, then attacked. The punch landed on Daniel's mouth, blood spreading quickly through his mouth. He slumped toward the wall, his head lightly hitting the bed frame. But Daniel didn't fight back. He didn't scream. He didn't shove. He only shielded his chest, where the watch was hidden in his coat. Footsteps rushed in. A guard shouted, "Stop," and burst through the door, pulling the young man away. Daniel shook his head slightly, signaling he was all right. He didn't want more trouble, But as the inmate was dragged out, their eyes met one last time, and this time, the anger had softened into something uncertain. Daniel lay down on the cold floor, his left knee curled from the dull ache of an old wound. That leg had once broken in Afghanistan when he pulled a young soldier from an explosion. They had said he needed surgery, but after Emily passed, he refused all treatment. He let the pain remind him he was still alive and still had something to carry. He looked up at the ceiling, imagined the night sky from back then, lying in a field hospital, listening to the roar of transport planes. At that time, he had said to a young soldier, eyes closed from blood loss, "Keep breathing. Kid, your story's not over." That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He didn't wonder why he was attacked. He wondered why people like that young man who had lost a brother, who had reason to believe in something greater, ended up here, discarded like nameless criminals. Maybe because people like me didn't speak up, because we stayed silent, because we thought silence was how to make amends. For the first time in over 10 years, Daniel felt that maybe he could and should say something. Meanwhile, in a second-floor office at the courthouse, the lights were still on. Judge Rebecca Whitmore sat in front of her computer screen, eyes tired and blurry from navigating records through multiple layers of verification. But finally, when the name Daniel Brooks appeared, along with a photo, she froze. The military file opened. No mistake, Daniel Brooks, logistics engineer, United States Air Force, deployment, Afghanistan, Twitur, commendation, Silver Star, awarded for saving 12 soldiers during the Kabul field station explosion. 2002. Among them, Private First Class Tyler Whitmore. Rebecca did not look away from that last line. Tyler, her son, had survived, carried out of the fire by a nameless soldier. He had once said, "I never saw his face. Just remember the last thing he said to me was, 'Keep breathing. Kid, your story's not over.'" She opened a small box from her drawer. Inside was the old letter Tyler had sent from the battlefield, now yellowed, the handwriting curled with the shaky hand of a boy who had just returned from hell. She had never known that soldier's name, until today. Rebecca picked up her phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in a decade. "Colonel Carter, I need to verify someone. A man named Daniel Brooks. Is it really him?" Silence on the other end. Then a voice, trembling. "Oh God, you found him." That morning, Boston was so quiet. You could hear footsteps crunching on snowy gravel, but the air around Suffolk Courthouse was thick, like the pause before a quiet storm. In front of the main entrance, 3 cameras were already set up. A group of veterans stood in their old military coats, shoulders bearing faded American flags, standing upright, as if waiting to be called in one final roll call. The homeless man they had read about in the papers yesterday, today, he would stand trial. But the story was no longer just about a minor assault by a homeless stranger. Courtroom 3B was so crowded, they had to bring in extra chairs. The early arrivals chose their seats in silence. The latecomers could only whisper, "Is it true he once saved an Air Force unit? I heard." The judge realized he's the one who saved her son's life, and he's still on trial for assault. The murmurs faded when Daniel Brooks entered, still the same man with his limping gait, the old pocket watch in hand, and eyes as deep as an endless winter. But today, he carried something more, the gaze of people who had never noticed him, now unable to look away. Beside him was Richard Harlow, attorney from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a steady voice like wind through an open field. As Daniel sat, his eyes were drawn to a back-row seat where someone unexpected stood. The young inmate from the night before was there, silent, gray coat, sleeves covering his tattoos, his eyes no longer full of anger, but something more like remorse and worry. Judge Rebecca Whitmore entered. Today, she carried not the fatigue of daily routine, but the eyes of someone who had seen an old face reappear in a faded photograph. She opened briefly, due to newly confirmed evidence from last night. Today's hearing will include witness testimony before any final ruling. The rear door opened. Colonel Carter, silver-haired, dressed in formal uniform, entered with the bearing of someone who had never bowed to danger. He recounted the entire event in Kabul. 2002, the explosion at the medical post, Daniel rescuing 12 soldiers. including Private First Class Tyler Whitmore, the son of the very judge presiding over this case. He never said his name, never took credit, Carter said. To this day, I don't know why he disappeared. Rebecca sat in silence. Her hand rested on the file as if letting go might make everything vanish. Attorney Harlow requested permission for Daniel to speak. Daniel stood, slowly, but with quiet resolve. He was about to begin, then looked down at the watch in his hand. His fingers trembled, unable to open the lid. A long silence filled the courtroom. Then, unexpectedly, the young inmate stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, voice slightly hoarse. "I was the one who mistreated him yesterday in the holding cell. I thought he was pretending, wearing dog tags to get sympathy." The courtroom stirred. Rebecca motioned for order. The young man continued, eyes fixed on Daniel. "My brother died in Kandahar, and I ended up here for causing trouble. But last night, after sitting alone thinking about this man, I realized something. No one wears a dog tag for 15 years unless they've bled for it. And he's the real deal." He stepped closer, gently placed a hand on the watch in Daniel's hand, and whispered, "I'm sorry, old man. Thank you." Daniel looked at him, and for the first time, something warmer than ash stirred in his eyes. A belief that silence may cause misunderstanding, but courage will always dissolve it. He turned to face the courtroom, and for the first time, he spoke not to defend, but to offer something. "I'm not here to be forgiven. I just want to say there are people who once fought for this country, but came back in silence, survived in the shadows, and were seen as trash. If I speak today, it's only to remind you they were someone, and they still are." Rebecca said nothing, but she stood. From behind the bench, she stepped forward toward Daniel. She didn't read a ruling. She simply opened her coat, took out an old sheet of paper, and gently laid it on the table. The letter from Tyler, her son, written from Afghanistan. I don't know the name of that soldier. I just remember when I was ready to let go, he grabbed my shoulder and said, "Keep breathing. Kid, your story's not over." Rebecca looked at Daniel. "You're the story I've owed myself for a long time." The courtroom was silent. Then someone stood. Then another, and then, without any command, the entire room rose as if part of a ritual never written in law, but carved into the heart. Daniel stood upright, holding the watch in his hand. The metal lid finally clicked open, revealing Emily's smile in the old photograph. He looked at it, then said softly, just enough for those truly listening, "I love you, Emily." And finally, they heard me. As the room slowly settled again, Rebecca took a deep breath and tapped the gavel gently. "This hearing is adjourned. We will continue reviewing the supplemental evidence and deliver a final decision tomorrow morning." Daniel sat down, his eyes still fixed on Emily's face in the opened watch. But this time, he said nothing. He let her smile quietly reflect under the courtroom light, like a promise that he would return, no longer invisible. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some were people who had once passed by him on the street without noticing. Some were veterans who had never met him, yet felt as though they had lived alongside him through 1,000 cold nights. And some were those who had once wrongly blamed him. A journalist stepped toward Daniel. "Would you like to say something?" he asked, microphone already live. Daniel looked straight into the lens. No hesitation. "I don't need anyone to apologize to me, but I hope, after this, the ones who were forgotten will be remembered, even if just once." Then he walked away, not toward home because he still didn't have one, but now he had a name restored, a voice that had been heard, and a family member who had found him again. The air in courtroom 3B still carried the weight of the morning before a trial without a verdict, but one that had shaken the entire city. The Boston Chronicle called it the trial that made time stand still. On social media, the name Daniel Brooks began appearing in thousands of shares. No one forgotten, silent hero, who still wears the tag. This morning, as Daniel walked into the courtroom, he was no longer a man escorted in silence. He was now someone met with eyes of reverence. He hadn't changed much, the same old coat, the same limping gait. But the change was in how he looked at everyone, no longer avoiding, no longer withdrawn. A man who had chosen to step into the light not to be seen, but to be heard. Beside him, Attorney Harlow opened his briefcase. Inside was a copy of a newly submitted video from the city's traffic camera system. Harlow had watched it repeatedly, and each time, he simply nodded to himself in silence. Judge Rebecca Whitmore entered, her silver hair neatly tied back, her eyes showing clear signs of a sleepless night. But her voice was steady. Today, we will examine the evidence relating to the assault charge against the defendant, Daniel Brooks, as well as hear motions from the prosecution. Across the room, a young prosecutor rose, sharp posture, neat suit, clear and proper voice. Your Honor, we do not deny Mr. Brooks's brave service in the past, but a commendable history cannot erase legal accountability. Even a hero, if he inflicts harm, must face consequences. A few soft murmurs rose from the courtroom, but were quickly silenced. Harlow stood. Your Honor, I request to present clear evidence that Mr. Brooks was not at the scene of the assault at the time it was recorded. He held up a USB drive and handed it to the court's technician. The screen above lit up. The footage from a traffic camera roughly 200 feet away from the scene played. A man, Daniel himself, was seen bending down to pick up a child's fallen glove and handing it back to the mother. Time, 9:47 p.m. The assault had been recorded at 9:46 p.m. at a convenience store across the intersection. It was impossible to be in both places at once, no longer deniable. In that brief silence, Daniel didn't look at the screen. He looked down at the watch in his hand, not to check the time. But as an unconscious gesture, the watch no longer worked. But it still held the most important moment, the time that had been returned to him. The prosecutor tried to respond. This footage does not cover the full scope. He may have passed by after the incident. We can't rule out the possibility. But Rebecca interrupted, gently but firmly. He handed a glove to a child, while the assault occurred more than 200 feet away. And there are no fingerprints, no direct witnesses identifying him as the perpetrator. She tapped her gavel lightly. The court accepts this as exculpatory evidence. A wave of quiet sighs spread across the courtroom. The assault charge is hereby dropped. Mr. Daniel Brooks, the court finds you not guilty. Daniel didn't react immediately. He simply closed his eyes, as if he had just heard something from the past being sealed away, not with force, but with justice. At that moment, the courtroom door opened again. A woman entered, carrying a wool cardigan and a paper envelope. She looked to be in her 30s, black hair tied low, her face worn from crying, but her eyes shone with something radiant. Excuse me, she said, voice trembling. I'm Jasmine Lee, granddaughter of Emily, Mr. Brooks's wife. I've been looking for him for 10 years. Daniel turned. Their eyes met like two torn pages finally being pieced together again. No questions needed. Jasmine stepped forward, gently embracing him. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped his shoulders tightly, as if letting go would mean losing him again to the streets. I thought you were dead, Jasmine whispered. But last night, I saw the live stream, and I recognized those eyes. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't cry. But when he softly patted her back, someone in the room couldn't hold back their tears. That was enough to begin anew. Daniel stepped out into the pale afternoon sunlight spilling onto the cold concrete. There were no cheers, no applause, but standing on the courthouse steps was a line of people. No one had asked them to be there. No one had led them. They simply stood, silently, dressed in old military coats, their badges tarnished, their shoulders slouched from the weight of wars long past. At the front stood an older black man, who slowly raised his hand in a formal salute. One by one, the others followed. No one said a word. But in that stillness, something was being restored, a thread once broken, now quietly rejoined. Welcome home, Staff Sergeant Brooks, the man said, his voice hoarse and raw, as if torn from the depths of his throat. Daniel paused. He had never expected to hear those words again. Welcome home. Not from a clerk at the VA office, not from the system, but from those like him, men who had held rifles, who had lost brothers, who had returned home only to feel they no longer belonged anywhere. To his right, a young reporter, the same one who had written a critical article about Daniel after his first arrest, approached. In his hands was that morning's paper, its headline printed in bold, "Veteran or impostor?" The question has been answered. He held up the paper, then slowly crumpled it. I wrote this. and I was wrong," he said, eyes cast down. "You don't need to forgive me. But I needed to say thank you." Daniel didn't respond. His gaze drifted toward the trees at the end of the street, where winter hadn't yet receded, then turned to the person beside him. Jasmine. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside was a military medal, the Silver Star, which Emily had kept safe her entire life in a small wooden case with a lock. "She held on to this her whole life," Jasmine said, her voice catching. "And I think now is the time it returns to where it belongs." She pinned it to his coat, right above the pocket, where his watch still lay. Silent and still, a shaft of sunlight crossed at that very moment, catching the polished edges of the Silver Star, not blinding, not showy, just enough for everyone to see. A symbol being returned. Across the street, a boy around 10 years old held up a hand-drawn sign, its letters clumsy but heartfelt. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for staying." Daniel looked at the boy and smiled. For the first time, that smile wasn't turned toward the past. It was turned toward the future. 3 days after being declared not guilty, Daniel Brooks walked through the glass doors of the Massachusetts Department of Veterans Services, carrying nothing but his worn-out coat, a pocket watch, and a letter he hadn't opened. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was called by his proper name, not vagrant, not defendant, but Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks, retired service member. Honor restored. A representative from the department handed him an envelope containing official documents, full access to health care, benefits, and a retroactive payment of more than $230,000 due to a system error that had lasted 15 years. But what rendered Daniel speechless wasn't the number, it was the handwritten note attached. "We cannot change the past, but starting today, we will help build the future." Daniel nodded. He said nothing, but the look he gave the officer, a young man from his former branch, carried a gratitude no words could match. News of the case spread quickly. The story of a veteran who had vanished from society's radar, misunderstood, cast aside, and finally reinstated sparked a wave of national reckoning. Within 48 hours, a nonprofit called the Brooks Initiative was born. It started as a spontaneous fundraising page created by fellow veterans. Within just 3 days, the donations surpassed $500,000. The foundation's mission was clear, echoing Daniel's own words. "If I could survive all of it, then others deserve a chance like the one I was given." The fund did not stop at helping homeless veterans. It expanded to support young people caught in the legal system, those lacking direction, or those left adrift after losing loved ones in war. One of the first beneficiaries of the program was the young inmate who had once misunderstood and attacked Daniel. There was no press conference, no scholarship ceremony, just a quiet afternoon at a vocational training center in Roxbury. Daniel stood outside the classroom while the young man learned to use his first set of tools. "What trade did you pick?" Daniel asked during a break. The young man hesitated, then broke into a smile. "I want to learn watch repair, like the one you were holding in court." Daniel was surprised. The young man scratched his head sheepishly. "Not because I know anything, but you fixed a broken watch for some kid, and somehow your whole life fell back into rhythm. Maybe I can start with something small." "Satu," Daniel didn't answer. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, a gesture like those shared in muddy trenches. Few words, deep hope. At the same time, policy reforms began taking shape. Under pressure from the public and the state legislature, the Department of Veterans Services pledged to audit all suspended benefits cases, reestablish a hotline for veterans without permanent addresses, and form an independent oversight branch to investigate neglected complaints. It all started with one man and an old dog tag he never took off. 1 week after the trial, Daniel was invited to meet the mayor of Boston in front of dozens of reporters. He was awarded a certificate of recognition for contributions to the awakening of community justice. But he declined to speak. Instead, he sent a handwritten letter, read aloud by Jasmine, Emily's niece. Her voice shook, but never faltered. "I never thought I'd become anything that mattered. But if my story helps, then let the attention not be for me, but for those still forgotten. If you have survived, endured in silence, and think you no longer matter. Know that you still carry a watch that hasn't ticked right yet, and if someone helps you wind it, time will begin again. The hall was silent, and in the front row, the young inmate bowed his head, tears quietly falling onto the polished wood table. A month after being exonerated, Daniel Brooks quietly moved into a small apartment in a southern Boston suburb. The home was rented for him by a community veteran fund, with a simple line etched on the front window. A house doesn't need to be big, just enough to begin again. He didn't choose to live near downtown. He didn't appear on television. He declined all interview requests. But there was one thing Daniel never refused: the handwritten letters that arrived daily from people he'd never met. One was scrawled in pencil. "My grandpa was a soldier too. We never got to thank him. Thank you for keeping time for us." Another, short and solemn: "I once passed you on Washington Street. Now, I wish I had stopped." At a public high school, during a history lesson, a teacher asked her students to talk about a silent hero society once forgot. A student named Jaden stood. In his hand was the pocket watch Daniel had once repaired for him at a bus stop the year before. He spoke not with flair, not dramatically, but with words etched into the air, about a man who once sat curled up on a street corner, letting the cold wind pass through him. About how that man fixed a watch for a boy without asking for a cent, and about how he remained silent for 15 years, not out of fear, but because he believed that if justice was real, it would find its way back on its own. Jaden paused, then said, "He never taught me anything with words, but from him, I learned this. Some people once kept time for others and no one noticed. And when time starts ticking again, that's when we must listen." At that moment, the watch in his hand gave a soft tick, faint, but everyone heard it. A moment of silence. Then the class broke into applause. That November, at the Suffolk courthouse where Daniel Brooks was once tried, a bronze relief was installed. It showed an old soldier holding up a younger one who was collapsing under a beam of light, shining diagonally from behind. Beneath it, a raised inscription read, "For those who were once forgotten, and for those who refused to forget them." On a nearby wall, a simple glass case with a brass frame stood quietly. Inside was Daniel's pocket watch, placed exactly where he had once held it tight while facing justice. That watch had once kept time for a silent soldier, and now it keeps memory for a generation nearly lost. No lid opened, no ticking needed, because some memories don't need to be measured by seconds, but by understanding. Because sometimes, when one person stops, it's so that time can move forward for others. I once thought justice was a verdict to be won, but now, I believe true justice is when someone is finally heard after a lifetime of silence. I once thought gratitude was just polite words, but now, I understand gratitude is the only light that guides those who have walked through the dark. So what about you? Have you ever passed by someone and not stopped? Have you ever seen someone carrying an untold story, and you might be the first person to hear it? If the story of Daniel Brooks made your heart pause, please do one small thing that could mean everything to us. Subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who may have once believed they were forgotten, because maybe they're just holding on to a watch that no one has helped wind yet.